History is written on the battlefield. It is a grand story of empires won and lost, of strategic genius and heroic sacrifice. We speak of the Romans, the Mongols, the great wars that shaped our world. But in the long, violent history of human conflict, there is one chapter that is often whispered with a mix of disbelief and quiet embarrassment. What happens when a modern battle-hardened army, armed with state-of-the-art machine guns, declares total war on a flock of flightless birds? The answer is not a victory, it's a national humiliation. This is the true and truly bizarre story of the Great Emu War of 1932. In the vast, sun-scorched plains of Western Australia, as the world grappled with the Great Depression, a different kind of crisis was unfolding. 20,000 giant, resilient, and surprisingly intelligent emus, driven by drought, had descended upon the farmlands, threatening to decimate the nation's wheat crop. In response, the Australian government did not send scientists or conservationists. They sent the army. They deployed veterans of the First World War, commanded by a major armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Their mission, to eradicate the feathered menace and restore order. What followed was not a simple pest control operation. It was a military campaign that would go down in history as one of the most surreal and comical failures of all time. This is more than just a strange story. It's a chilling case study in human hubris, a lesson in underestimating your enemy, and a psychological autopsy of a military blunder so profound, it became an international joke. Join us as we dissect the anatomy of a conflict where the enemy had no leader, no strategy, and no fear, and still won. To understand why a nation would mobilize its military against a population of flightless birds, we must first go back to the end of the Great War. Thousands of Australian veterans returned home, promised a new life and a piece of their own land as a reward for their service. These were tough, resilient men, survivors of the horrors of Gallipoli and the Western Front. The government granted them parcels of marginal land in the vast, arid expanse of Western Australia, encouraging them to grow wheat and build a future for the nation. It was a noble, optimistic vision, but the reality was a brutal struggle. The land was harsh and unforgiving, and just as these soldier settlers were beginning to establish their farms, the world plunged into the Great Depression. The price of wheat on the international market crashed, leaving the farmers in a desperate, impossible situation. They were heavily in debt to the government for their land and equipment. And now, the very crop that was supposed to be their salvation was worth next to nothing. They were trapped, their dreams of a peaceful, prosperous life turning to dust. As if that weren't enough, nature itself conspired against them. By 1932, a severe drought had gripped the interior of Australia. This forced the native emu population to migrate in search of water and food, and they found it in the new, irrigated wheat farms of the soldier set. This was not a small flock, it was an army. An estimated 20,000 emus, in their annual breeding migration, descended upon the farmlands of the Campion district. For the desperate farmers, this was the final breaking point. They watched helplessly as this feathered horde devoured their crops, trampled their fences, and destroyed their only hope of surviving the economic crisis. Now, we must analyze the enemy. The emu is not a simple farm pest. From a military perspective, it is a formidable adversary. These are the second largest birds in the world, standing up to 6 feet tall. They can run at speeds of over 30 miles per hour, 50 kilometers per hour, in a rolling, tank-like motion, as one soldier would later describe it. Their thick, shaggy coat of feathers acts as a surprisingly effective form of natural armor, capable of deflecting small-caliber bullets. But their greatest strength was their tactics. Emus, as the Australian military was about to learn, are brilliant guerrilla fighters. They do not move as a single, predictable herd. When attacked, they instantly split into countless small, leaderless groups, running in every conceivable direction, making them an impossible target for concentrated machine gun fire. The commander of the operation, Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery, would later compare them to Zulu warriors, capable of absorbing heavy casualties while their main force continued its advance. Faced with this resilient, intelligent, and seemingly invincible enemy, the soldier settlers were powerless. Their rifles were no match for the sheer number and chaotic tactics of the birds. In a state of desperation, a deputation of these former soldiers traveled to Perth to meet with the Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce. They were soldiers asking for military aid. The government saw an opportunity. The press was full of stories about the farmers' plight. A military intervention would be great public relations. Furthermore, the military saw it as a chance for some live target practice for their machine gunners. The decision was made. the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery would be deployed to the Campion district. The Australian military, veterans of the Great War, were about to engage in their first major conflict since that global catastrophe. Their enemy was not a foreign army, it was a bird. The stage was set for one of the strangest battles in modern history. The arrival of the military contingent in the Campion district on November 2, 1932, was met with a wave of relief and excitement. Here at last was the solution. The force was led by Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. With him were two soldiers, Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran. Their arsenal was formidable. 2 state-of-the-art Lewis automatic machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. These were the very same weapons that had cut down waves of soldiers in the trenches of the Great War. Against a disorganized flock of birds, the task was seen as little more than target practicer, swift, brutal, and almost comical affair. A local news cinematographer even joined the convoy, eager to capture the decisive victory for the cheering audiences back home. The first engagement was planned as a simple ambush. A local scout reported a flock of approximately 50 emus heading towards a clearing. Major Meredith, with the cool professionalism of a seasoned commander, ordered his men to set up their position. The farmers were instructed to act as beaters, attempting to herd the flock of unsuspecting birds into the machine gun's kill zone. Imagine the scene. 2 battle-hardened soldiers, lying prone in the red dust of the outback, sighting down the barrel of a weapon designed to repel human charges. Their targets, a group of giant flightless birds, but the enemy proved to be more cunning than anticipated. The emus, upon seeing the farmers attempting to flank them, did not panic and run in a predictable herd. Instead, as if guided by a single chaotic intelligence, they instantly split into dozens of small, leaderless groups, running in every direction except towards the waiting machine gun. The order was given to open fire. The Lewis gun roared to life, its staccato bark echoing across the plains, but the bullets were largely wasted. The gun, designed for stationary targets, could not track the fast, erratic movements of the birds. The small groups presented no single, viable target. After a furious burst of fire, a handful of emus fell, but the vast majority vanished into the landscape, completely unharmed. The first battle was over. The result was a frustrating, embarrassing failure. Undeterred, Major Meredith planned his next attack with more care. 2 days later, on November 4th, his forces prepared a much larger and more promising ambush. Scouts had reported a massive congregation of over 1,000 emus gathering near a local dam. This was the perfect opportunity. The soldiers set up their machine gun on a rise overlooking the water, a perfect kill zone. They waited patiently as the enormous flock, unaware of the danger, made its way closer. The tension mounted. The birds were now in perfect range. This time, there would be no escape. Major Meredith gave the signal. Gunner O'Halloran squeezed the trigger. The Lewis gun fired a short, angry burst, perhaps a dozen rounds, and then silence. It had jammed. In that critical, fleeting moment of mechanical failure, the entire flock of 1,000 emus, startled by the initial shots, scattered. They exploded across the landscape in a chaotic, feathered wave, vanishing into the bush in a matter of seconds. By the time the gunner had cleared the jam, the battlefield was empty. The tally for the day was a mere 12 dead birds, at the cost of hundreds of rounds of ammunition and a catastrophic loss of morale. It was at this point that the psychological autopsy of this war began, not by a historian, but by Major Meredith himself. In his official report back to the Ministry of Defense, his tone shifted from confident commander to a man wrestling with an absurd and unexpectedly brilliant foe. He wrote, and I quote, "The emu is an amazingly difficult bird to kill. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." He noted their guerrilla tactics, their ability to absorb wounds, and the infuriating way their leaderless flocks would scatter and reform. The soldiers who had arrived expecting a slaughter found themselves outmaneuvered and humiliated by an enemy that did not even possess the cognitive ability to understand it was at war. The machine guns, their symbols of technological superiority, had proven useless against the chaotic, unpredictable force of nature. After nearly a week in the field and thousands of rounds fired, the Royal Australian Artillery had managed to kill perhaps 50 birds out of a migratory army of 20,000. The press was beginning to report on the failure. The war was not going well, and the emus, it seemed, were winning. Stung by the initial failures and the surprising tactical genius of his feathered adversaries, Major Meredith was forced to reconsider his entire strategy. The static ambush, a classic tactic of trench warfare, had proven useless against an enemy that refused to follow the rules. He concluded that if the emus would not come to his guns would have to go to the emus. A new, more mobile phase of the war was about to begin. The plan was audacious. One of the 10-ton Lewis machine guns was to be mounted onto the back of a speeding truck. They would become a modern cavalry, a mobile firing platform that could chase the emu flocks across the open plains and gun them down as they ran. In theory, it was a sound application of modern technology. In practice, it was a descent into pure, unadulterated slapstick comedy. The soldiers soon spotted a small flock and the chase began. The rickety truck roared to life, bouncing and rattling violently over the rough, uneven terrain of the Australian outback. On the back, the gunner O'Halloran struggled to maintain his footing, wrestling with the heavy, vibrating machine gun. His target was a flock of emus, running at full speed, their long legs carrying them over the ground with deceptive ease. The result was a complete fiasco. The truck was simply not fast enough to gain on the birds. The terrain was so rough that the gunner could not get a steady aim for more than a fraction of a second. He fired burst after burst, the thousands of rounds of ammunition kicking up huge clouds of dust, but hitting almost nothing. The emus, according to one report, seemed to find the whole affair rather amusing, effortlessly dodging the truck and scattering in all directions, their chaotic retreat patterns once again defeating the logic of the machine gun. The chase reached its comical and disastrous climax when Major Meredith, in his zeal to get closer to a flock, ordered the truck to go off-road. The driver, focused entirely on the fleeing birds, failed to see a small farm fence directly in their path. The truck plowed into it, crashing to a halt. The pursuit was over. The emus, unharmed, vanished into the distance. Not a single bird was killed in this mobile assault. The army had been defeated, not by the enemy, but by their own chaotic tactics and a small wooden fence. This moment is the psychological turning point of the story. It is the complete breakdown of the illusion of control. The military, a global symbol of order, discipline, and technological superiority, had been reduced to a bumbling, self-sabotaging mess. Their attempt to impose a rigid military order upon the chaotic, unpredictable force of nature had resulted only in their own humiliation. The Great War machine had been defeated by the sheer anarchic spirit of the Australian wilderness. Word of these failures began to reach the press, and the tone of the coverage shifted from patriotic support to open ridicule. Newspaper articles across Australia, and soon, the world began to mock the Great Emu War. A conservationist in the Australian Parliament famously argued against the campaign, pointing out the absurdity of veterans of the Great War being unable to defeat a flock of birds. The operation was becoming a national embarrassment. Faced with mounting public ridicule and a clear lack of results, the Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, made his decision. On November 8th, less than a week after the first shots were fired, he ordered a full withdrawal. Major Meredith and his men were recalled. They packed up their machine guns and their thousands of unused bullets and retreated from the field of battle. The soldiers who had arrived as celebrated saviors now left the district in disgrace. The official report was grim. After days of intense engagement, thousands of rounds fired, the First Great Emu War was over. The Australian army had been routed. The farmers were once again left alone to defend their crops from the victorious feathered horde. But the story was not over. Major Meredith, his professional honor stung by the humiliation, was not ready to admit defeat. He was about to regroup, re-strategize, and demand a second chance, a final decisive battle to reclaim his honor and win the unwinnable war. The withdrawal of the military from the Campion district was met with a chorus of ridicule across Australia and the world. In the Australian House of Representatives, politicians lampooned the entire affair, one opponent declaring that the military should have to award a medal to every single emu for its bravery in battle. Newspapers published cartoons of soldiers running in fear from giant, aggressive birds. The Great Emu War, a name originally coined with patriotic seriousness, had become an international punchline. The army's honor was in tatters, but for the farmers on the ground, this was no laughing matter. With the military gone, the emus, now completely unafraid of humans, returned to the fields with a vengeance. The destruction of the wheat crops continued, and the farmers, who had briefly tasted the hope of salvation, were now more desperate than ever. They renewed their pleas to the government, arguing that their livelihoods were on the verge of total collapse. Caught between the public humiliation and the genuine desperation of the soldier settlers, the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce, reluctantly authorized a second campaign. On the 13th of November, Major Meredith was once again sent into the field. But this was a different Major Meredith. The overconfident commander who had expected a simple target practice was gone. He had been replaced by a grimly determined man with a newfound, grudging respect for his enemy. He had learned from his mistakes. The war was about to become more serious, more methodical, and far more brutal. There were no more grand theatrical ambushes. There were no more comical truck chases. The second phase of the Emu War was a long, grinding war of attrition. Major Meredith abandoned the idea of wiping out the entire EMU army in a single, decisive battle. Instead, he adopted the very guerrilla tactics his enemy had used against him. His unit engaged smaller, more manageable flocks. They became more patient, using the terrain to their advantage, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This new strategy was far more effective. The kill rates began to climb steadily. On the first day of the renewed campaign, they killed approximately 40 birds. A few days later, they ambushed a flock and killed over 100 in a single engagement. For the next month, Major Meredith and his men relentlessly hunted the emus, engaging in dozens of small, scattered skirmishes across the district. When the operation was finally concluded in mid-December, the official numbers seemed to tell a story of success. The final report stated that 986 emus had been killed, using 9,860 rounds of ammunition. This was a rate of exactly 10 bullets per confirmed kill. Major Meredith also claimed that an additional 2,500 birds had died from injuries they had sustained. On paper, the military had been vindicated. They had faced the enemy, adapted their strategy, and inflicted heavy casualties. But this is where our psychological autopsy must ask a difficult question. Was this really a victory? They had killed, by the most generous estimate, around 3,500 birds, but the original migratory force was estimated at 20,000. The vast majority of the Emu army had survived the war and, as the season changed, had simply dispersed back into the interior, as they always did. The military had not defeated an army. They had merely inflicted a flesh wound on a massive, migrating population. The cost of the operation in terms of military resources, time, and national reputation was immense, likely far exceeding the value of the wheat that was saved. The true winner of the Great Emu War was, once again, the emu. The birds had forced a modern mechanized army to deploy not once, but twice. They had dictated the terms of the engagement, forcing the soldiers to abandon conventional tactics. They had humiliated a military major and had become a permanent and embarrassing fixture in the annals of military history, and ultimately their species had survived the encounter with barely a scratch. The final humbling lesson came in the years that followed. After the war, the government, realizing the inefficiency of a military solution, finally implemented a more practical one. They offered a bounty for emu skins. The farmers, now economically incentivized, took up the task themselves. Over a 6-month period in 1934, they claimed over 57,000 bounties. The problem was eventually managed not by soldiers and machine guns, but by the simple principles of economics. The Great Emu War officially ended in December 1932. The soldiers went home, and the major claimed his hard-won victory. But the conflict's true legacy is one of profound human folly. It stands as a timeless and comical reminder that for all our technology, all our strategic thinking, and all our pride, the chaotic, unpredictable force of nature will often have the last laugh. And so, the guns fell silent. The Great Emu War ended not with a treaty or a surrender, but with a quiet, bureaucratic memo recalling the troops. The soldiers returned home, the farmers were eventually given a more practical solution, and the emus, victorious and unvanquished, continued their ancient migration. The story has become a historical punchline, a bizarre anecdote told to illustrate the absurdity of the past. But to dismiss it as a simple comedy is to miss its profound and unsettling lesson. The Great Emu War is more than just a strange story. It is a perfect and timeless case study in the anatomy of folly. It is a deep dive into one of the most dangerous and persistent flaws of the human mind, hubris. Let's conduct our final psychological autopsy. The Australian military of 1932 was a proud and professional force, forged in the fires of the First World War. They were masters of a specific kind of logic, the logic of order, discipline, technology, and overwhelming force. They saw the world as a problem that could be solved by applying these principles. When faced with the EMU problem, they saw not a complex ecological issue, but a simple military objective. The enemy was a pest, and the solution was a machine gun. This is the first and most critical error in the psychology of folly, the attempt to apply a familiar solution to an unfamiliar problem. They failed to understand the nature of their enemy. They were prepared to fight a conventional army that would march in predictable formations. Instead, they faced a force of nature, a chaotic, leaderless, and completely unpredictable entity that did not follow any rules of warfare. The emus didn't have a general to outsmart. They had a collective, biological imperative to survive. Every time the soldiers tried to impose their rigid, logical order onto this chaotic system, the system simply flowed around them, rendering their plans useless. This story is a powerful parable about the limits of brute force. It teaches us that sometimes, the biggest gun is not the best weapon. The military's strategy was to apply maximum force, but the problem didn't require force. It required a different kind of thinking. The eventual solution, the bounty system, was not a weapon of war, but a tool of economics and understanding. It worked with the existing system instead of trying to declare war on it. And this is where the 90-year-old story becomes a chillingly modern lesson. We see the Great Emu War played out every day in our own lives. We see it in the corporate world, when a massive company tries to solve a complex market problem with a huge, expensive advertising campaign, only to be defeated by a small, nimble startup that understands the culture better. We see it in politics, when governments try to apply rigid top-down solutions to complex social problems, failing to understand the chaotic and unpredictable nature of human society. And we see it in our own lives. What is the Emu War you are currently fighting? Is it a difficult relationship where you are trying to win with brute force arguments instead of patient understanding? Is it a creative project where you are stuck trying to apply a rigid plan to a problem that requires a more flexible, creative approach? The ultimate lesson from this strange conflict in the Australian outback is that true intelligence is not about the power of the weapons you possess, but in the wisdom to understand which problems can be solved with force and which cannot. It is a reminder that the world, and the people in it, are often far more complex and resilient than our simple plans account for. Think about a problem in your own life where your current strategy isn't working. In the comments below, tell us, what is your Emu War? Let us discuss the moments where we all have been humbled by a problem that refused to be solved by simply trying harder, because the first step to winning the war is realizing you might be fighting the wrong one.